The prices we see today, from groceries to fuel to building materials, are shaped by explosions that stopped decades ago. World War I and World War II didn't just redraw borders, they ripped apart the global economy and rebuilt it into the system we all live inside now. And with global tensions rising again, it's worth asking what actually happens to the world's economy when war scales beyond politics and turns into something that forces nations to reshape everything from trade to money to survival. Before World War I, the world was strangely optimistic. Trade was rising, empires were rich, and people believed globalization would keep peace. But that illusion shattered in 1914. The moment war began, factories stopped producing consumer goods and were converted into machines for guns, shells, and uniforms. Millions of workers were pulled away from farms and industries, which caused shortages and rising prices. Governments borrowed enormous sums and printed money to keep the war going. And when the fighting finally ended, Europe was physically broken and deeply in debt. Germany was hit with crushing reparations. Inflation surged across multiple countries, and trade collapsed under tariffs and resentment. The world didn't recover. The unresolved economic damage from World War I fed directly into the Great Depression and created the instability that opened the door for the next and even deadlier war. World War II magnified all of this tenfold. By 1939, economies were already shaky. Once the war began, nearly every major country went into full-scale mobilization. Civilian production was slashed. Factories ran non-stop producing tanks, planes, steel, and munitions. Unemployment vanished, not because the economy was healthy, but because every nation was in total survival mode. Rationing became everyday life. Behind the front lines, the war consumed oil, metals, food, and manpower at rates the world had never seen. Entire cities across Europe and Asia were burned to the ground. Infrastructure ports, roads, railways, power stations, industrial centers was smashed beyond recognition. But out of the ruins, a new economic world was built. The countries that survived realized they could not repeat the chaos that followed World War I, so the Allies designed a new global system. They created institutions to stabilize currencies, fund rebuilding, and encourage trade. The US launched the Marshall Plan, injecting billions into Europe's reconstruction. Not just as aid, but as a strategy to create stable trading partners and prevent extremist movements from rising again. This decision rewired the global economy, making the US dollar the center of the financial world and laying the foundation for decades of growth. Japan rebuilt with modern factories and new technology. Western Europe used American capital to rebuild infrastructure and industry. Global trade expanded rapidly, and the idea took hold that economic integration would prevent another catastrophic war. Today, that idea is weakening. We are not living in World War III, but the world is clearly moving toward a more dangerous and unstable period. Russia's invasion of Ukraine disrupted global grain, oil, gas, and fertilizer supplies. The Israel-Hamas conflict and attacks on shipping routes have rattled global logistics. The relationship between the United States and China has shifted from cooperation to confrontation. Tariffs, sanctions, chip bans, export controls, and supply chain decoupling are becoming normal. Countries are raising military spending, redesigning supply chains, and stockpiling resources. At the same time, global debt is near historic highs. Inflation remains volatile, and governments have far less financial room to maneuver than they did after World War II. So what would actually happen if the world slipped into a major conflict today? First, global trade would collapse almost instantly. Modern supply chains stretch across dozens of countries, and even a small disruption can shut down factories across continents. A major war involving global powers would close critical shipping lanes and choke off essential imports like oil, grain, rare minerals, and semiconductors. Prices for food, energy, and manufactured goods would spike. Countries dependent on global trade, which is almost every industrial nation, would feel the shock immediately. Second, financial markets would fall into chaos. Investors would flee uncertain regions. Stock markets would tumble. Currency values would swing violently. Countries might impose capital controls. Central banks would face impossible choices between funding the war effort and fighting inflation. Banks would tighten lending, investment would freeze, and companies would struggle to operate. Third, governments would redirect almost all economic activity toward defense and essential services. Civilian industries would be pushed aside as factories become part of the war machine. Labor shortages would intensify. Rationing would return. Everyday goods would become harder to find. The economy would still function, but it would be an economy built around survival rather than growth. Finally, the destruction of infrastructure would cause long-term damage. Modern economies rely on digital networks, semiconductor fabs, advanced logistics hubs, and complex manufacturing chains. Destroy even a few key nodes, and the ripple effect can set an entire region back decades. Rebuilding after a major modern war would be far more difficult than after 1945, simply because today's economic systems are more complicated, more global, and more fragile. If the war ended without total nuclear destruction, the world would face the same question it did after the last two major conflicts. How do we rebuild, and what kind of system replaces the one that failed? History tells us that wars destroy old economic orders and create new ones. They shift power, redistribute wealth, break dependencies, and build new alliances. The next global conflict, even if limited, would reshape the world's financial system, supply chains, and political relationships in ways we can barely imagine. Right now, the global economy is showing early signs of strain. Supply chains are being weaponized. Trade routes are more fragile. Nations are spending more on defense. Economic trust between superpowers is fading. History is warning us that these conditions are exactly what often come before a major conflict. The hope is that the world can learn from the past. But history has a habit of repeating itself when people assume it won't. If you want to understand how the backbone of the global economy was shaped by past crises, and why today's rising tensions matter more than ever, hit the like button, subscribe, and join us in the next story. The lessons of the past are warning signs for the future, and the price of ignoring them is always higher than anyone expects.